Welcome to the Nerd Journey Podcast. Our goal is to help you, the technology professional, accelerate your career progression, increase your job satisfaction, and be more effective in your existing role.
We want to bring listeners like you the career advice we wish we'd been given earlier in our careers.
I'm John White, at VJourneyman on Twitter, sharing co-host duties with Nick Cordy at NetworkNerd_.
We're two former IT operations guys who have moved on to pre-sales roles with technology vendors. We have our opinions, but we also like to highlight the journeys of others and see what we can learn from them.
We'd also like to ask for your feedback to make this a conversation, not a one-way broadcast. Email us at nerdjourneypodcast@gmail.com or DM us at nerdjourney on Twitter. So come join us on our nerd journey.
Let's take a trip. Episode 293. Have you ever wondered if you're solving the right problem? Well, the problem we need to solve to get the results we want might not always be what we think it is. Abby Clobridge is the founder and lead consultant at FireOak Strategies, and she and her team use a detailed discovery process to help their customers do exactly that, solve the right problem. But it takes questions and answers to gain clarity on what the right problem is to get the outcome we want. If you missed part one of our discussion with Abby in episode 292, we talked about her career as the intersection of library science, information architecture, and working with technology. She did things like query optimization, statistical analysis work, news research, and worked on digitization projects. This week in part two of our discussion with Abby, we'll talk about how her previous experience helped her move easily into the field of consulting and why she decided to start a consulting business. You'll learn what knowledge management is and why it's important. We'll talk about how companies think about knowledge management, how they prioritize or deprioritize it, and we'll talk about some of the things we as individuals can do to improve knowledge management within our organization, even if the organization isn't incentivizing us to do it. Let's get to part two of our discussion with Abby Clobridge.
And yeah, risk absolutely comes up and governance comes up and trying to manage all of this. It's really interesting.
I agree with you. Living in that in-between space had to have been something you really enjoyed, because I feel like that was the relatable experience you took to consulting when you chose to go down that path. Because that's kind of what you were doing, right?
I think so. I mean, yeah, learning how to navigate kind of the squishy space between things and have the conversations and raise the issues and let other people make informed decisions based on what they know about the organization. I think the other common thread career-wise is I like to solve problems. And so the problem, whatever it was for the organization, and then once you've solved it, it's like, okay, I'm ready to go on to the next thing. And that's not the most sustainable career path sometimes. When you've solved problems in a year or two, you have to pick up and move to the next place and the next job. As a consultant, I get to do that all the time. So that perspective has definitely influenced the work that I've been doing and how we approach it. And I always tell our clients, and I truly mean this, when they don't need us anymore, I think that's a win. That means that you've graduated. We've solved the problem that we set out to solve, and I feel really good about that. So it might not be the best from a business perspective, but it's really how I approach things.
Well, I think it might be okay from a business perspective, because then you turn your clients into advocates for you, right?
Yeah.
For every client who graduates, they're going to refer 10 people. That's the hope for exponential growth. But now that you bring that up, can you maybe talk a little bit about that transition to starting a consulting business and what brought you there?
Yeah, I think when I first started, it was sort of the next thing. It was I had narrowed things down and recognized that I did have kind of an unusual background in that I was working in technology, but I was not coming at this from a programming perspective or an engineering perspective at all. And I think my ability to do that translation piece and think about process and think about governance and think about compliance and intellectual property, it was unusual 15 years ago. And I was able to leverage that. And I like working in that space. So that all made sense. But it was really around the problems and like, what problems can we solve and how can we help organizations? And I started out as a solo consultant, like a lot of people do. And I did not have visions of growing to a 100-person company. That was not the plan at all. So I started the company in 2010. So it's been almost 15 years at this point. And the first 5 years or so, I was by myself. I think everybody sort of learns when you run a company like that, there's only so many things that you can do at one time. And if you want to stay as a solo person, then that's great. But it definitely impacts at a certain point projects because you can only take on so many things at once or so projects of a certain size and a certain nature. And so there was a specific project that I really wanted to take on. So that was kind of the point where it went from being a one-person company to a couple of people. And I don't want to get to the point where I'm spending most of my time managing other people and I'm not doing the consulting work because I really enjoy the consulting work. So there's always been a conscious decision to stay small, stay the size that we're at. Yeah, kind of how it started, but started small and grew kind of one project at a time and one experience at a time. Going out on your own is it's a challenge. I don't think anybody who's gone that route really knew exactly what they were getting into. That's been my experience. And anytime I talk to somebody else who's followed that same sort of, I'm going to start my own company. It sounds like a great idea kind of plan. I was a good consultant, but I didn't necessarily know anything about running a business. And so you have to learn that really quickly and learn how to manage your own time and figure out what are you going to do? What are you going to outsource? And even by outsourcing, I mean, what are you going to give to an accountant and who's going to call the insurance company and who's going to call the lawyer and who are you going to call because you don't even necessarily know because you don't have in-house counsel for the first time and dealing with all of those things while trying to get clients and trying to deliver to the clients that you have. It's an interesting experience and my background did not prepare me for. So I don't know too many people who would have had experience in that space going out on their own. Yeah.
Did someone encourage you to go into business for yourself?
No, that was my own, I'm going to try this and see what happens. In my, I don't know, however many years since I had been in grad school and taken my first professional job, I had probably moved 6 or 7 times over that period of time. And it was old. I did not want to keep moving constantly every time I wanted a new job. That was a huge motivation. And I didn't really want to keep having to quit every time I solved the problems I was trying to solve. It also just gets draining. So the thought of doing something different and having more variety, that was all really appealing to me. But I honestly had no idea if it was going to work out or not. I was early enough in my career that I figured I'd try it for a year or two, see what happens, and then go from there. It was not a multi-year thought out plan at all.
Did you have a pool of connections to start with?
It's a really good question. Had you developed a pipeline of potential?
No, I really didn't plan this. This was not a well-executed plan by any means. And I truly didn't know how it was going to go. I had a decent number of connections from the jobs that I had had, but I did not have a whole series of projects lined up at all, which is not advice that I would give anybody. So if you're thinking about doing this, then it's a good thing to have a couple of projects lined up right away.
That absolutely makes sense. In the ideal world of starting your business, you already have customers somehow or a pipeline.
Exactly. But it's a good plan.
As you said, doing all that development for the first time, you don't know what you don't know. But it also sounds like you felt like failing out of the gate wasn't going to be a disaster. Like you could always go back, right?
Yeah, I think that's really what it came down to. I had been interviewing. I've interviewed for a lot of jobs over the years for a bunch of different reasons. And I can get through any interview at this point in time, I feel like. I was hearing myself going through the interviews, though, and why do you want this job? And I could give answers that were perfectly fine. But I wasn't feeling it, for lack of a better way to put it. Like, yeah, I could go and I could do this job in my sleep. I'm positive I can because it's a job I've done before. I've solved this problem already. This environment is really similar, but I don't really want to do it. I'm not going to be happy doing it. And I think I had that realization of, I don't really know exactly what I want to do next. And I had been working at that point in university libraries for probably about 10 years at that point. And I knew I didn't want to be a library director. Trying to figure out, okay, well, what does that mean? And I have all this experience that's kind of all over the place, but all connected to information management, architecture, technology. So what do I do with this? I felt like there were a ton of different things that I could do, but none of them were what was supposed to be on paper the next step. And it was just time to try to figure out something totally different. And so I was kind of approaching it from that angle. And yeah, I felt like I could always go back and try to get one of these jobs that I was interviewing for, because nothing was going to change if I went out of the gate and failed as a consultant. But maybe it would work, and it was worth trying. And I had a lot of years left to work. So I really wanted something. I wanted to try to do something that I thought I could enjoy and wasn't going to be bored doing, and could do some interesting things. And technology was changing, and I wanted to be able to take advantage of that. And I didn't really want to be a manager. That was another piece that I had figured out at that point in time. By then, I didn't want to spend 60% of my week managing other people. That was definitely an inflection point for me. It's kind of realizing that. And I don't know that everybody gets to figure that out. So that was a good lesson.
Was the 60% because of, as you alluded to, the logical next step based on what you had done?
I was doing more than that at my last job. Just when you start factoring in, okay, well, in higher ed, there's sort of an assumption you're going to have an hour one-on-one with everybody who's reporting to you, and do that times however many people, and you have a one-on-one with your direct supervisor. And if you're managing 3 departments, they each are going to have an hour-long meeting every week. Okay, well, we haven't gotten any work yet, and that's a lot of hours in your work week that are filled by doing that kind of one-on-one meetings. And if that's not something you enjoy doing and you really want it, like my feeling was, how do I get back to the work? And someone said, well, this is the work. Oh, this isn't the work I want to do. And that was a moment for me.
You haven't even mentioned the skip level meetings that you have to do periodically, right?
And performance reviews and new hires and all of that. Yeah, it's a lot. And some people are really good at that. And that's not for me. And I know that.
I think that's perfectly fine. I think that maybe when people aspire to become managers, maybe they don't know that that is the job.
Yeah, that was a challenge for me in the library world. And I think it's a little different now. And I think it's a little bit different the more on the technical side that you get, that there are some positions where you can find more of a balance. But there are a lot of positions that just, within an organization, the higher up you get, the more time you're spending in that kind of meeting and the less what I think of as work you're doing. And I'm not sure that that's a fair statement, because the other work is really work. It truly is. But if you want to be able to focus and put your head down and write a new script that does a thing, or write a report or something along those lines, then stopping because you have a 2:00 meeting with somebody can be really frustrating for some of us, at least. So, and I learned that about myself, and was just trying to figure out, well, how can I take what I like to do and create my own job instead of shopping around to try to find one that's perfect.
That's extremely insightful. And I think we'll probably have to connect some metadata around the section of the interview about, the deciding whether or not one wants to be a manager.
It's a good question.
Yeah. You're going to have to shorten your tags, John.
Manager - decision point.
There you go.
Yes, question mark.
I mean, I faced that this week. I was at a conference, internal work conference, and we had a technical session about some interesting new products that we were bringing to market. And kind of programmed against that was how to be a better technical manager. And I went, I know that I want to go to the new product sessions, but that's not actually my job anymore.
Exactly.
I'm a manager, and my job is to, my technical session is how to advance my skills on being a technical manager. Until you face that, you might know it intellectually, but to feel it emotionally is a completely different thing.
Yeah. And when you start giving people who report to you the projects that you want to do and that you want to be working on, it can teach you a lot about yourself.
Oh, yes, definitely. Is it okay if we dive into this area of knowledge management? I'm fascinated about when you as a consulting organization come in you're providing value, but I'm wondering if that's, hey, to do these things, you probably don't know about the existing toolkits that exist to solve that problem, or is it you don't know about the procedural things and maybe incentives within the organization that you need to set up, maybe the cultural changes, a combination of the two, or something else that I'm missing?
It's different for every organization, but we often get called when clients know that there's something that they could be doing better, but they're not quite sure what it is. And they've sort of exhausted all of their thoughts internally. And it frequently can be as simple as, we think we need a new intranet, but finance doesn't want us to go shopping for a new intranet. My answer is, you might not need a new platform. A new platform is probably not going to solve your problems, but it might. Sometimes it does. Let's actually diagnose what's going on. Is it that people aren't able to find what they're looking for? Does that mean because it's not there, or because they can't find it because it's a not useful search engine? Or is it not organized well? Or do they not have access to what they're looking for? Or is it a platform problem? Or is it, with the access question, it could be an internal organizational culture issue. It could be that the organization has a culture of internal hoarding because people don't want to share with each other for a whole bunch of different potential reasons. Or is it because nobody ever thought to do it? Trying to figure out, is it a governance thing? Is it a process thing? Is it a platform and technology issue? Is it a metadata thing? It can be just so many different problems, and making sure that we're solving the right problem is the really key thing. So we spend a lot of time kind of in that diagnosis discovery phase, trying to make sure that we're solving the right problems. Early on, as a consultant, I had a client hire us specifically because they wanted a new taxonomy. And at that point in time, I could tell from the initial conversations, the taxonomy was not going to be the issue. It wasn't going to solve their problems, but that's what they wanted. Trying to figure out, well, what is it going to take so that we can make sure that we're solving the right problem, so I can not waste our time and not deliver something that is not going to fix this, but really figure out what is the real problem that we're trying to solve. Some organizations are more willing to actually address things than others, which is really interesting. I mean, at this point, it's been 15 years. We've worked with a lot of clients that have just incredibly different approaches to everything. And this is where organizational culture definitely plays a huge role in this. And how serious the organization is about changing is different from organization to organization. Some will pay lip service and say, yeah, we want to change, but then they really don't want to. Or what's it going to take to fix it? And if it's not write a check and buy a new platform, they sometimes are really excited about that, and other times really don't want to hear it.
This is a fascinating topic for me because, I've worked in my career for maybe 5 or 6 different organizations. And I think we all have a tendency to draw a trend line from that tiny little data set. I'm fascinated to hear from somebody who's actually worked with, many, many more organizations than that. But I've worked for one organization, I think, that had baked into its culture this sense of, the more information that you write down and the lessons that you've learned, the information that you share is a sign of the value that you have within the organization. And I'm just wondering if that is, more common than I've seen in my career, or just as uncommon as I think it is.
It really depends on the organization. Some organizations mean it, but they don't have the right approaches to actually encourage staff to do that. So they'll say we mean it, and then incentives are the opposite. So we see that sometimes. And that's where it's kind of important to figure out, well, what are people being measured against or for, and how are performance evaluations, how do they fit into this? And how does HR fit in? And how does the organizational culture as a whole fit in? Do the dots all connect and say the same thing and actually encourage what the organization thinks that they're encouraging? Or are there really big things in place that make it really, really difficult to do that? It's not unheard of, but it takes a lot of work to get to that point for most organizations. And so trying to figure out, well, how do we help transition the culture, and how do we shape the culture over time to get to that point, it's often one of the things that gets sort of lost anytime the economy changes or there are big organizational changes or a new CEO or something at the top that affects the organization in a holistic kind of manner. So it's easy for organizations to kind of fall back into a more of a pattern of we don't have time for documentation, we don't have time to share things, and we don't really value that aspect of it. And it just would take away from something else rather than organizations seeing that it would actually make the organization more efficient and more effective and maybe get time to product shorten or new hires up to speed a lot faster. If there's a very specific pain point that they've already addressed, like I'm thinking about a couple of clients that we've worked with where one client in particular, when they came to us, they said, it takes 3 years before we have a person in this particular position fully up to speed. That's a really, really long time. And if you can shave off 60% of that time, that's enormous. And that translates into direct dollars really quickly. But that's an unusual situation. I mean, even for a typical company, if they say it takes 6 months to get a new hire fully comfortable and fully up to speed, if you can shave some of that time off, that can be really powerful. How do you do that? Well, you do that through documentation. You do that by having regular knowledge sharing within teams on a regular basis through conversations. We talk about it. We talk about lessons learned, something that goes sideways. Well, what does that mean? How do we apply that? And one of you said something about failure earlier. And I think that part of knowledge management is learning how to, saying embrace failure is probably a little bit strong, but getting more comfortable with not everything working and what do we mean by that and how do we learn something from that so that we don't make the same mistake next time, or we don't, even if it wasn't necessarily a mistake, how do we do things in a different way moving forward and not do the same thing consistently? And all of that is really very much embedded in the knowledge management kind of mindset. Sometimes it's as simple as changing a mindset.
Even the classic, definition of the growth mindset is accepting the potential of failure, right? In order to grow, potentially we have to make mistakes and learn from those mistakes. Maybe even the genesis of this entire conversation and the reason why I reached out to you was I think I read this blog that you wrote, the 8 Ways to Incorporate Knowledge Capture into Everyday Operations. And you made a reference to it just now, integrating knowledge management into performance reviews. And the idea of setting up company incentives so that one of the ways that you can be judged more positively as an active and high potential contributor to the organization is the amount of knowledge that you've generated and documented and made available for everyone was kind of mind-blowing to me, because that has never been something that I guess I've experienced at an organization. Maybe, like I said, maybe once. When I was at Google, like one of the things that you could put on your kind of self-assessment was, hey, I wrote these documents and they were accessed, 10,000 times or whatever, so that's a really good indicator of how effective that I am at giving back to the organization. But I don't know that all organizations have that. And it was kind of mind-blowing to me. Hey, we should set up the incentives as a knowledge organization or an intellectual property organization or an organization that it takes time to learn all of our stuff. Like anybody who's contributing to making things easier, to make solving problems faster, that is somebody who is of value to the organization.
Yeah. And we want to encourage that, and we want others to do the same. And so how do we say this is the kind of behavior that we really want here, and we really value it, and we encourage it.
Right.
It's a big deal. And it's an easy way for organizations to kind of spotlight and showcase what individual contributors throughout the organization are doing, or at least have the potential to be doing. You don't have to be in a management position to do this. You don't have to be in a leadership position. This is everybody has value within the organization. So, hey, I'm a brand new hire. I just stepped into this role and I realized that there wasn't a handbook or a playbook or a standard operating procedure. So I took it upon myself to document all of this, and then I'm sharing it with others so others can benefit from it. You don't have to be in a senior position to do that. But then the organization needs to not turn around and say, hey, you wasted time doing that. They need to say, this is a great thing and we really appreciate it, and we're going to show you how we appreciate it.
there's no one better to tell you where your blind spots are than the people who don't know that information, don't know how to find it, and can point that out to you, right? That's how you solve those problems. So of course, my standard joke here is, oh, great. So what tool do we buy to fix that? And I'm guessing that that's not a thing.
And I was going to say, we usually say that we are platform agnostic, and I am not a huge fan of standalone knowledge management systems or platforms, much to many platform vendors' chagrin. But if you're a Microsoft organization, most of the time you can make it work within the Microsoft ecosystem. If you're a Google Workspace ecosystem, it may not be as pretty, but you can do it. There's a way to do it in whatever platform you're using. You can do this in Salesforce. You can do it in anything. I know there are plenty of people who are really partial to Notion and Obsidian. Those are the two personal knowledge management platforms that are all the rage right now. And I'm all for that for your own personal stuff. But for work-related things, having knowledge captured and therefore searchable and findable and reusable within the places where people are going to do that, that's where it needs to live, even if it's ugly.
I've been a tools agnostic person, for most of my career, but I do have to say that the things that are super popular, the note-taking tools that you mentioned, Obsidian, whatever, those are all in the category of personal knowledge management. They're not really built for teams of more than one. They don't scale.
And they work really well for you to get your second brain into something that makes sense to you. And that's fantastic. But trying to, with knowledge management and organizational knowledge management, the goal is a new person in the organization or somebody who's new to a role or somebody who hasn't done something in a while can find something and make sense out of it and have it help them quickly and easily. And you don't want to try to translate into, well, this person is thinking about it this way and I'm doing it this way. And you want to cut out all of that and make it as easy as possible.
I do have to say that those tools have brought something to the forefront, which I find super interesting, which is, the idea of the backlink, as metadata in the document, right? What are all the documents that link to this document? That is something that really seems to be missing from most standard data platforms, your SharePoints, your OneDrives, your...
Not arguing with that at all. And I think all of those platforms have plenty of room for improvement. I'm not going to say that any of these things are the end all be all. And I think that some of the new stuff, I'm hoping some of the new platforms that are coming out can really change. I think the platforms are going to drive some of that. And I think AI is going to drive some of that 5 years from now. Like SharePoint of 15, 20 years ago was a nightmare to use. It still has its issues. It still has its quirks, but it's a lot better than it used to be. And hopefully Microsoft has been doing a good job of trying to incorporate some of these other things. I was playing with Loop yesterday. It's not there yet. There's still a long way to go. It's not Notion, but they're at least trying. And so I appreciate the trajectory that they're going down and trying to bring in some of these things to make it easier to link stuff together and find the glue between things and the patterns. I'm hoping in 5 years, it'll be very different than today.
Yeah. I also wonder, though, if there's a danger in some of these things. Well, you mentioned specifically AI tools. And if you have a tool that kind of sits over, I think Glean is the one that seems to be super large in enterprises. Oh, we'll just get Glean for enterprise search. One of the things that it'll do is it'll do an AI summary, based on a text search that you do. But now you've lost the link between the underlying knowledge document that maybe actually solves a thing. And maybe you've lost the link of that, whoever's authoring that document or curating it, getting credit for answering that question.
And having it totally misinterpreted as well. You're just out of context. So,
yeah, very true.
Speaking of out of context, do people take knowledge management and what it means out of context? Let me explain what I mean when I ask that question. So at a software company, you have people who are technical writers who write the documentation that's public facing, right? You have technical marketers who might write blogs or make videos and things like that. That's certainly knowledge that has to be managed. Is knowledge management, when we're talking about it, is that focused on like internally accessible to employees? Is it public facing to that employee's customers? Is it both? And Do customers of yours who need help in this area understand that?
The last question is not always. They don't always understand it. And the short answer is, I personally think knowledge management can mean whatever it needs to mean for any company. So I do try to get organizations when we're starting out, if the goal is to have a new knowledge management strategy and likely an implementation roadmap that goes along with it. What problems are we trying to solve? And sometimes that's internal, sometimes it's external, sometimes it's both. I'm thinking about a couple of clients in particular where they started out thinking about the external knowledge base that clients or customers were using or that they didn't have that should be in place. But it was mostly that external facing customer client contact center as the middle space, maybe contact center, and not necessarily the internal knowledge management aspects of it. So everything that we're talking about in terms of onboarding new staff members or the internal standard operating procedures. And in other organizations, we're like, yeah, we have that, but what we're most concerned with is the lessons learned, that we're not sure what to do with, or we'll talk about it, but we're not capturing it. And then we're making the same mistakes, or we're doing the same thing over and over again. And how do we take the knowledge that we collectively have to focus on continuous improvement or build things better, build things faster, do whatever it is that we're doing in a faster, more efficient sort of way? It really does get back to that question of like, what problem are we trying to solve as specifically as possible? What are we trying to get out of it? And defining that so we all have a shared understanding of it. But it's always going to be something in the general space of creating new knowledge, reusing existing knowledge. Security comes into play often with this. How are we properly managing and securing what we're doing? AI is bringing in this whole new level that people were not interested in the archiving aspect or deleting things, data retention and deleting old data and digital rot. That was something we could not get anyone to pay any attention to for a good decade or so. Like, why should we delete it? It's not doing any harm. Well, now it is. You're getting bad information from your AI. That's a reason to delete it and to clean things up and organizing stuff in a meaningful way to say, this part of our collective internal knowledge that has been captured in some sort of file or format or digital asset or artifact, that part is off limits to everybody. But this stuff is the stuff that we care about and should share internally. And this stuff we could share externally, and we should. And how do we make the most of that? And that's kind of the segue from open access and the work I was doing a long time ago from a career perspective to focusing on internal knowledge management or external too. So for some organizations that are publishing research, how do we make that as easily findable and reusable as possible? But who's the audience and what are we trying to accomplish?
Speaking of that question, what are we trying to accomplish? How does it generally go when a customer thinks they're trying to accomplish one thing, and after your discovery, you actually tell them what you need to accomplish is this after we assessed all the different perspectives and variables?
I try as much as possible to stress early on, this is why we do discovery. We want to make sure we're solving the right problems. And I've got plenty of examples of organizations that didn't, and they're in the situation that they're in, and they're throwing more money after the same problem because 3 years ago they built another intranet and it didn't solve any of their problems, but they migrated then and we don't want to replicate them. Well, then let's approach this in a different way. Let's really do discovery before we decide we're going to spend money on something else. That's the value of discovery. Are we sure we're solving the right problems? Because there might be a very simple solution that is, I say simple, organizational culture and governance have the potential to be really simple. At least there's not a direct price tag associated with them, but often it's the most complicated to solve. Sometimes it's just reorganizing things. Sometimes it's tweaking what's already there, but they're using good tools, using good metadata or refreshing it, or knowledge base projects and intranet projects in particular. Often it's a governance issue where there's stuff that goes into the knowledge base or the repository or the intranet, but then there's no governance around how often does it need to get maintained, who's updated it, do you have the subject matter experts looking at these things in detail? And if they are, is it clear to the users? Frequently, there's just no indication on a file or a page or whatever it is that this was last updated by this person. It is validated. It should be trusted. Yes, it is still good. And here's our seal of approval to go with it. And incorporating all of those procedures around managing that knowledge base or repository or intranet is really important. But sometimes that's where things fall down. Not always, but often.
It's so fascinating that those are things that people just generally don't think about. Like, hey, how do we maybe report that this article is out of date?
And whose job is it to do something about it?
Right. Is there a leaning or a philosophical point of view that you have about central governance on that versus crowdsourcing within an organization?
It totally depends on the organization and the space that they're working in. How important is it that something be exactly precise? And so when you're dealing with anything that's FDA regulated or organizations that are working in super technical spaces where it matters exactly how many times you screw something in or move this to a specific degree, it needs to be precise. I don't think crowdsourcing is the way to go. But if it's more of a, here are our best practices or ways of doing something, that's when crowdsourcing can be really valuable. Or if it's an organization, we work with a lot of nonprofits, and often there are ways of doing things, but there's not necessarily one right way. It's just, this is how we do it. That's where crowdsourcing can also be really important and useful. It depends on the nature of the output or the artifact itself. And it doesn't have to be all or one for any particular organization, but where it matters, where that level of preciseness is important, I think, and that you need the subject matter expert and you need somebody who's going to be held accountable for it. That's where it's really important. We worked with a nuclear energy organization recently, and I think we want that to be precise and we want that to be exactly signed off on by the subject matter experts. And it's really important to get everything super, super crystal clear. So that's a good example of where it matters. But that was the nature of the work that they were doing. And other things, even with the same organization, could be crowdsourced. The other issue with crowdsourcing stuff is that nobody is responsible because everybody is responsible. And therefore, whose responsibility is it that we get things updated and that we have it maintained and that somebody has signed off and saying, this is still the way that we're doing things. And then you also get into kind of the HR component. So for really big organizations, if you're crowdsourcing everything, what's the balance? Is everybody able to spend a little bit of time contributing? And how does your manager feel about that? And is it consistent within the organization? So if the organization has taken the approach that we will crowdsource and we are collectively responsible for this, then that's okay. But then it needs to be clear in terms of responsibilities, roles and responsibilities, accountability, and expectations, and making sure those align. And that's where HR comes into it.
Wow, I never even thought about the HR component. Yeah.
If we dovetail onto the HR component, let's think about job candidate interviews for a second. There might be some ways that we could evaluate a company that we're interviewing for in terms of knowledge management to see how good maybe our experience working there will be. Are there some good questions that we could ask in an interview that would tip us off?
Knowledge management, that phrase means different things to everybody. But if you ask a question about knowledge sharing, everybody can usually latch onto that in some sort of meaningful way. And I would ask somebody that you're interviewing with, how do you describe the organizational culture here in terms of knowledge sharing? What's the norm? What should I expect as a new staff member? And see if you get a completely blank look or somebody who's really struggling to answer that question, or can they rattle off, oh, well, we have weekly town hall meetings with an Ask Me Anything component of it, and we really pride ourselves on transparency, and people are encouraged to share knowledge. And we have these 5 programs I can point you to that are part of the norm that we do things. We think this is super important as an organization. Or do you just get the, what are you talking about? Yeah, kind of response, or somewhere in between.
Is knowledge sharing part of a performance review? Is that a performance review metric?
Yeah, it isn't at that many places. I think it's an incredibly valuable one. I would encourage it to those who are in a position to do something about that. I think it can really accelerate changing the culture like nothing else. So if you want to look at the organizational culture holistically, that can be a really great way to do it fairly quickly, as opposed to a 10-year sort of trajectory really slowly. But it's unusual.
Can I quickly ask the types of organizations that you think your consulting firm could best help? Is there a profile of organization that FireOak Strategies really thinks is the sweet spot for them?
Now, we work with a lot of different kinds of organizations, but they tend to fall into two groups. We have a bunch of clients, and we have over the years that are small to mid-size organizations, so frequently around 50 employees, which is pretty small, to a couple hundred, or organizations that have grown really quickly. So they started out really small, maybe even a mom and pop shop, and then started growing and have realized that their internal processes, tech stack, how they're managing their knowledge is not going to scale as they continue to grow, and they want to do something to kind of get ahead of that. So we work with a lot of organizations that size and space, and then we work with a lot of Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 size companies that are kind of on the other end of the spectrum. And they're mostly at least starting to look at things either for a specific division within the organization, frequently operations. We work with a lot of operations divisions over the years. So either looking at internal knowledge for a specific group. So we have a knowledge base, we have a repository, it's frequently a knowledge base, or an intranet site just for that particular division. It can be a global division, so globally dispersed. But it's those, how do we do things for whatever our organization's focus is? So it can be technology, it can be, if it's that size, it's usually a technology company. So they have the tech skills internally, but they don't necessarily have either the time or somebody internally to say, this just isn't organized in a way that we can find things, or search is failing us, why, and what can we do to make it easier to get people the answers that they're looking for in a way that they can use them faster, because every second counts or every minute counts. Or the same size companies, but they're looking at it in terms of that external facing aspect. So call center or a knowledge base that's public facing, where people are just they're not happy. There's a general disgruntled kind of feeling that we could do things better, and we're just not sure why or how. And often it's because everybody is so close to the content, they can't necessarily read it or digest it from the perspective of somebody who is external. So do we have 1,000 acronyms? Do they just not mean anything to somebody new coming into the organization or a customer? Or is information outdated? Lots of times companies will have products that change over time, and your knowledge base is talking about something that was 3 releases ago. And that might still be relevant, but it might not be relevant. Or how do you find the right thing? Or people are just landing on the wrong page for all sorts of reasons. So lots of organizations kind of in those two buckets, and everything in between. But those are kind of the best fit.
That's super helpful to know. I think that's a wide spectrum, either helping the small shops get things right so as they scale,
which can be really fun.
Yeah, and maybe even, act as a catalyst for that scale.
Yeah.
Or the organizations that have already scaled and are looking at maybe information inefficiency or friction. And, maybe this is an area where they can take a lot of friction and inefficiency out and, maybe act as another catalyst for growth.
Right. Somebody once described it as this like gnat, the thing that they couldn't quite put their finger on, but it was like a low level buzzing that they kept hearing. I can't find what I need. It's too hard. It's too long. It's too cumbersome. It's too whatever. And it was, the artifacts were there, the knowledge or the content or the files or whatever it was there. It just wasn't great to use. So it was always sort of this like low level priority, and we know it could be better, but we don't really know what to do about it. We don't really have time to do about it, and we're not sure what to do. That's really what it comes down to. And then it kind of gets overwhelming because, we've got 3,000 pages in our knowledge base and nobody wants to sit down and go through it. Or we have 30,000 files scattered across a bunch of SharePoint sites. And I got to say, nobody is super excited at how can we go reorganize our files in SharePoint. It's not a fun task, but what would the benefits be? And so it usually takes getting to a certain tipping point before somebody is willing to do something about it. But you're in a much better place to do some really cool and interesting things afterwards and use the gleans of the world and other AI tools for that internal knowledge once you have it structured and organized so you can really do something with it. And that has been the thing that I think has been really transformative in the last year, is that organizations are saying, we're not there yet, but we know we're going to be there in a year or two. So what can we do to get better prepared for that? Because we know it's coming.
Is there a legitimate need within organizations to have like something along the lines of a librarian role? Maybe the implications and the connotations of that specific title are not correct, but something along the lines of that?
We've been seeing more knowledge manager roles and knowledge management departments. The one thing that I recommend to our clients is don't see that person or that department as the person you're just going to like go dump your stuff and they're going to magically make it organized and rewrite it or check off the box that, yes, this has been validated. That person or that team should be there to help make sure things are happening across the board. So if you're talking about an operations division, for example, I wouldn't see the knowledge management team being the ones responsible for actually going and updating the 3,000 pages in the knowledge base, but they're making sure the systems are there and that whatever automation is in place to make sure that, yes, your page is up for review because you're on a 6-month review cycle and that person is getting notified and the right people are getting notified, and making sure that that process is happening. That's what their role is. Not to go knock on doors and say, hi, subject matter expert, you now need to update your page and actually do that. And I'm going to take your page edits back and then go edit them for you. Or just do kind of that work or have them say, oh, it's good enough. Well, is it really good enough? It's just serving as that catalyst to make sure things are happening. But there needs to be some level of accountability for those who are actually responsible for pages. And that's the piece that I've mentioned, governance, where things tend to fall apart. Everybody is busy. Everybody has time. Jobs change. People change. Whatever, roles change. So who is really responsible for whatever process it is that that page is describing and making sure that that person or group is doing something about it?
In a company where the organization as a whole doesn't really buy into the knowledge sharing, knowledge management mentality, what can the leader, let's just say first line leader, do to create a culture of knowledge sharing on their team to improve the work of at least that team, even though above them, around them, maybe that doesn't happen?
Yeah, I think there absolutely are things that the first line leader can be doing, and thinking about, especially if it's a team where there has been turnover either in the past or you're expecting to add some new positions or it's likely that there will be some turnover, thinking of it from the perspective of, we have a new employee who's coming in, or we might have a new employee coming in. What can we be doing to document things to make it as easy as person for this person to be successful as quickly as possible and feel confident that they know how to do things the way that we want them to do it? You're probably hiring people who are coming in with a set of skills. So we're not going to teach somebody Python scripting if that's what's needed for this job. We're going to assume that they can either figure it out or they have that skill already. But we want it documented in this certain way, or we want it done in this certain way. And here's our company or our department's special way of doing things. And that's the part to focus on. So write things up and write your manual for a new person in that department. And then how can we as a group collectively do it so it's not just one person? And how can we say, oh my gosh, this has been so hugely helpful. I was working with a client, now a former client, and they were talking about had not been doing standard operating procedures. There was nothing documented. There was absolutely nothing within the organization. It was a mid-size nonprofit, so relatively small organization, but each department was then responsible for documenting their SOPs, and they had this exact situation. So one particular department, they were pretty much ahead of the rest of the organization. They had already been doing this on their own, kind of in a slightly informal way. But they weren't waiting for the whole organization to say, yay, now we're going to do SOPs. So they had been doing it on their own, and they really were ahead of everybody else. Somebody left unexpectedly, and it was a small department, and there were very specific ways of doing things, and they had documented it, and they were able to hire somebody and fill that position, and they were just talking about to the rest of the organization, like, we saved ourselves collectively a huge amount of time. We didn't have problems with things getting dropped or missed or skipped. We were able to continue delivering on our department's work, and sharing those success stories was definitely helpful in encouraging other departments to start doing things more from a grassroots perspective rather than a top-down perspective. But talking about what you're doing with others, with your peers at that level, so other managers of other departments, and saying, yeah, we used to spend 6 months really, or 6 weeks after we hired somebody, watching every single thing that they were doing and showing them how to do it and put in a ticket and escalating things, whatever it is that they were doing. And now we're down to a couple of days with some extra questions, and we keep adding those new questions into our knowledge base. and just changing how we're doing things. And when we had the next person hire, it was even easier for us because we already had most of this documented. We just had to make some updates. Sharing those success stories, really helpful.
Well, we definitely appreciate you sharing yours.
Yeah, Abby, I think that's kind of a mic drop moment for knowledge management, on the small scale. And, hopefully that type of thing inspires people to do this, and on the individual team and even the individual contributor, just igniting the movement within the organization. Maybe we'll put it that way.
Sometimes it just takes a couple of people to really start things up.
Be the catalyst for change within your organization for knowledge management.
Absolutely. Or even, at the start of a new job, walking in to a new position and recognizing that there is this gap, and taking it upon yourself as the new hire to say, look, this is what I put together because I didn't have any tools or systems in place to do this. And I'm sharing this with you. I mean, that's a huge thing for a new hire to do and contribute.
Absolutely. That's amazing.
Well, listen, Abby, thanks so much for taking the time to share this discussion with us, and we know it's going to be valuable to our listeners.
You're welcome. It was so nice to speak with both of you. I really enjoyed it.
Where can people find you and contact you if they want to follow up? Is LinkedIn the best way?
LinkedIn is the best way to reach out. Yep. I'm easily accessible there. Thanks.
I like the way Abby referred to the things she enjoyed doing as the work. As I heard it, Abby's definition of the work is solving problems for customers, talking with them and figuring out what the right problem to solve is. She didn't want to get too far from that over the course of her career. And being a consultant allows her to continue to do that type of work, even though she is also the business owner and founder of FireOak Strategies. So I hope that if you're a business owner out there, or somebody who's going to start a business, that you structure it in such a way that no matter how large your business grows, you still get to do at least some of that work that you really love, that you really enjoy. Yes, there will be administrative tasks, but don't forget to scratch the itch that got you started. What if I'm not a business owner? I'm just an individual contributor or a manager at this specific company. Well, have you thought about the things you do as part of a normal day or week that you really enjoy? Are there ways that you can do more of those things? Can you take on more projects in a specific area? Can you get deeper in a specific technology? Can you collaborate with a certain group of people more often? And if you can't, maybe you can do some learning on your own to scratch that itch. Or maybe you can look at job descriptions that have the things you really enjoy doing and have expertise in as the first couple of requirements. I know that's hard in a tough job market like at the time of this recording, but it's food for thought as you think about those must-haves that the Real Job Talk hosts talked about a couple episodes ago. Abby's story also reminded me of a couple other previous guests who have been consultants. First of all, Chris Williams. In episode 229, he talked about becoming a consultant to avoid boredom. Every 3 to 6 months, he would get to go and do something new. I think that really aligns with the way Abby works. Once she's solved a problem, she likes to go on to the next one. Consulting helps her do that by just moving on to the next project in a different environment, different nuances and variables to consider. And then also David Klee. Back in episode 119, he talked about when a customer has him come and help them solve a specific problem, the next time that happens, the customer can solve it on their own, and he wants that customer to call him again next time for something different, a new problem. I think that aligns with what Abby would want as well from her customers, because once the consulting firm has solved the problem for the customer, they have graduated. I think that's a great attitude to have for a business owner that makes money from consulting. And it also goes back to the fact that consulting not only is doing the discovery, making sure we solve the right problem, but also educating the customer on processes best practices, how to do this and fix this next time. I was also reminded of our discussion with Chris Wall in episode 149. Near the very end of that episode, we didn't call it knowledge sharing specifically, but Chris was talking about people inside his company using blogging as a way to build connections with coworkers. There's a really good blog article in the show notes of that episode that Chris wrote about this in detail. And in the episode with Abby, we talked about some companies wanting to capture and integrate those lessons learned. Well, by sharing those lessons learned in the same way Chris Wall was talking about in these internal blogs, I could see that as building connections with my coworkers by sharing those things with one another. So it could build camaraderie to get knowledge management right within an organization. And if more people are updating content and writing, it actually builds the communication skills of the entire team. I think that is another benefit in addition to everything we talked about when we think about creating a culture of knowledge management. You're going to have a culture of writers and content creators and people who are becoming better communicators. If you like this episode, we'd love to hear what you liked most. Have you rate us 5 stars and write about it in a review. Share this episode with a friend. And we'll see you next time.
Farewell, listeners. Tune in next time as the journey continues. I'm John White at VJourneyman, for Nick Cordy at NetworkNerd_, signing off.
Adios.